Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Creating a Culture of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Lessons from the Past and Strategies for the Future, being presented by the Leadership Development Group with Dr. Dale Caldwell and his father, Reverend Gilbert Caldwell. I'm Jess Molson, the Director of Client Solutions for TLD Group. Just a few quick notes before we get started. Please note that all attendees are automatically on mute for the duration of the webinar. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit your queries via the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel, and our presenters will respond to them during the Q&A period at the end of today's session. Additionally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will provide a link to the recording to all attendees. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Tracy Dumerman, President and CEO of the Leadership Development Group, for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you all for being here today. We are so excited to have such a large turnout for this very important event. As a firm dedicated to developing leaders, teams, and organizations to execute strategy, my colleagues and I at TLD Group have spent a lot of time reflecting on the nature of leadership, and most recently on the important role that leaders play in facilitating the types of systemic and structural changes that need to happen in this country. We believe that in order for systemic change to take place, we must work collectively to expand awareness and enhance the ability to take action. Today's webinar is designed to do just that. So without further ado, it is a great honor to introduce your presenters today, Dr. Dale Caldwell and his father, Reverend Gil Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell is the CEO and founder of Strategic Influence and an executive coach, team consultant, and OD advisor with the Leadership Development Group. He is a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University and the author of 6 books, including the popular Intelligent Influence, The 4 Steps of Highly Successful Leaders and Organizations. He was the first African-American senior manager in the Management Consulting Division of Deloitte in the New York and New Jersey region, and is the founder of the Black Entrepreneurship Hall of Fame, the Black Inventors Hall of Fame, and the Black Tennis Hall of Fame. Dr. Caldwell graduated from Princeton University with a degree in economics, received an MBA in finance from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and a doctorate in educational leadership from Seton Hall University. Joining Dale today is his father, Reverend Gil Caldwell, who is a retired United Methodist Church minister who has pastored churches in Boston, New Haven, Brooklyn, Harlem, Chester, Pennsylvania, and Denver, Colorado. Reverend Caldwell first met Dr. Martin Luther King in 1958 while he was a student at Boston University. He actively participated in the 1963 March on Washington, the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer, the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March, and the March in Boston protesting public school segregation. He's a graduate of North Carolina A&T State University and Boston University School of Theology. He received an honorary doctorate of divinity from Dakota Wesleyan University. For his leadership and work, he received social justice awards from the Church Within a Church movement and the Methodist Federation for Social Action. Reverend Caldwell is the author of the books What Mean These Stories and Just the Right Word. He's been married to Grace for 62 years, and you may recognize them from the famous CBS News story about them being denied admission to Mount Airy Lodge on their honeymoon in 1957. So without further ado, Dale, please proceed.
Tracy, thank you. Thank you very much, and we'll advance. It's such an honor to be here and to be part of this just amazing series that TLD is putting on. As some of you know, my dad, the best laid plans. My dad is 86, my mom's 85. They live with me. My dad was feeling lightheaded on Monday and very, very weak, so we took him to the emergency room and then they put him into a very nice suite. We were hoping that he would be out now, but he's undergoing a series of tests. So I'm going to kind of kick off this presentation, talk a little bit about his experience in the civil rights movement, and I'm going to give him a call. And if he's not going through testing, he's going to be part of this. So thank you for bearing with us. He's doing okay. He's doing better. He's in good spirits. So So that's really what's important now. And as you'll see, my dad and I and my mom were very close and just blessed to have those kinds of influences. So I want to begin the presentation to say, why does this matter to business? Why, if you're in business, why should you even be talking about that? Well, the equity, diversity, and inclusion are fundamental to doing virtually everything that's important within a business, which includes team effectiveness, which includes employee retention, employee engagement, enhanced hiring, sales growth, the next generation leadership development, or hiring. And so one of the things, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in some detail, and we'll give you some thoughts on how to implement this in your organization. And this is geared towards both corporations, nonprofits, and even governments. So I always want to begin with these terms that we're talking about now: diversity, inclusion, and equity. That so often, and I think some people are often too scared. I've had people from me say, well, what do these terms really mean? So I always like to start and just hit them head on. So first, diversity is really about people with different opinions, backgrounds, experiences. It's not just about race. It can be religious beliefs, political beliefs, sexual orientation, heritage, life experience. So diversity is really the plethora of different people. And we'll talk about in the organizational context why that's important. Whereas inclusion is really, it's the concept and practice of putting diversity into action by creating an environment of involvement, respect, and connection. Historically, diversity was rare. Now it's more the rule, not the exception. And so a lot of firms would say, okay, well, we believe in diversity, so we just hired a lot of people. Didn't really look at what roles they had or if they were fully included. And so now inclusion has taken on a life of its own, and their practice is really focusing on that. And so these kind of contrasts it's important to understand. So diversity is simply a representation of many different types of people, as I just said. It focuses on the differences and referred to as the mix. Inclusion is the deliberate act of welcoming diversity and creating an environment where all different kinds of people can thrive and succeed. Inclusion is the act of making the mix work, making this diversity work. Diversity is what you have, inclusion is what you do. Simply having a diverse group, team, workforce is not enough. Everyone should feel safe and encouraged to fully participate and share and be on equal footing as everyone else. So, just as people were kind of getting this understanding of diversity and inclusion, this next thing, equity, was brought into the mix. And so a lot of people are confused, well, what's equity? And where does that fit into the mix of things? And so equity really is seeking to ensure fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness in access to information and resources for all. So to make sure that it's not enough to have a diverse group, not enough to have a diverse group that you give opportunities to, but to make sure that they have the same opportunities as others. Not more opportunities, but the same opportunities. And a lot of people think that that's happening, but the more you peel the onion back, you start to see that there really isn't the kind of equity that many people think there is. So let me kind of talk about my dad, and then we'll try to get him on the phone. And so as you heard, my dad met Dr. King in 1958 as a student at Boston University. My dad led in organizing a march to integrate the Boston public schools in 1965. Many people think that that all the marches were in the South. Well, integration has been and still is. I live in New Jersey, and New Jersey is the third most segregated school system in the country. So segregation still is not legalized, but so this march in 1965 really brought my dad, connected with Dr. King. And so here he is on the left with Ralph Abernathy, who was kind of the second in charge leader of the civil rights movement, and Dr. Martin Luther King at a press conference announcing the march in Boston in 1965. Here, as my dad marching next to Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy, escorted by a police officer through the Boston Commons and the streets in Boston. At the rally, at the march, Dr. King with a megaphone, really talking about integration in the Boston public schools. And so that fueled a lifelong drive for being involved in the civil rights movement. My dad was in Selma, marching on Selma, the famous Selma Bridge. which I think will be called the John Lewis Bridge if things go as planned. He was in the Mississippi Freedom Summer. He was in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What a lot of people don't realize is Dr. King knew it was about economics as much as integration. And so often that gets lost in the movement. But later in the 70s, my dad also fought for corporate inclusion. Here he is with Jesse Jackson in New York City, where the A&P wasn't hiring people of color. And so my dad and Jesse Jackson were actually arrested protesting the lack of inclusion way back in the 70s. And so it's important to understand the connection to this time. Dad? Hi, Dad. I'm on this webinar now. We have I can't see the number, but I know more than 200 people signed up for it. So I have a picture here of you and Jesse Jackson. And so, do you want to say a little bit about your involvement in the civil rights movement?
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks for inviting me to participate. I first heard Martin Luther King in '57 because the Supreme Court did a third anniversary of the school integration event, and I went from seminary to go down to hear him. Then in 1958, we invited him to come by his alma mater, Boston University School of Theology. He's a graduate with a PhD, and of course I have an MD there, and just had a wonderful visit with him. With the students, his charisma from the pulpit did not somehow get in the way of his interaction with us. And I knew that here was a person who was really special and I would follow, particularly as an African-American Southerner. I obviously had, over the years, been deeply concerned about segregation and a number of other things. And so I went to the March on Washington. Actually, I left the church meeting in Chicago to take a special train down to hear him, and was just very, very, very amazed by his speech. I had a dream. And of course, John Lewis's comments as well. That was, of course, '63, then '64. And then after, of course, to do things in Mississippi in terms of voter registration, schooling for young people, some of us volunteered to go to Mississippi. I was in a place called Parsons Crossings, New Jersey. Excuse me, the phone is ringing here. Parsons Crossings, Mississippi. I was there for a summer. That awful summer when 3 civil rights workers were killed, 1 black, 2 white and Jewish. So obviously it was a time of great fear for us, but I felt I had to be there. Then in 1965, of course, we know Bloody Sunday. And after Bloody Sunday, Dr. King asked a number of us to come to Selma to sort of witness, and many of us did. I have still no idea how many of us were able to get there the Tuesday after the Bloody Sunday. I was there from Boston with a white Unitarian minister, Reverend James Reeb, who gotten to know. He with a group of friends went out to eat that evening, was beaten, and later died, and I participated in a memorial service in Boston. And then in Boston, where I was pastoring, we were deeply concerned about school segregation in Boston, and so we invited Martin King to come and help us confront the Boston School Committee. And that was when I was closest to him. The pictures that maybe Great Dale has shown represent that. I was very involved with him the 2 days he was in Boston, marching next to him, being with him when he attended some of the public schools, and then of course marching to Boston Common, where he spoke, and I had the opportunity to introduce him. And then finally in 1968, of course, months after after the assassination of Martin King, I participated in the Poor People's Campaign. I guess I would sort of finish that as that. Being involved beyond my job as a pastor, I found being involved in the movement really made meaning for me, and I will never forget it. And my great concern, the pleasure, is that Dale is providing opportunities for me to talk about the civil rights movement, because it seems to me so many people don't know it, so many people don't understand it. We've forgotten about it at this moment in history. We need so much the civil rights movement, a commitment to justice for all people, and also doing it in a nonviolent way. So should I stop there, Dale?
Well, Dad, first of all, I know for some, because we had to do it by phone, it's hard for some people to hear, but you know, this is better than the major news. You're lying on your back in a hospital room and you're talking to the crowd. So this is the first time you've done that. So I hope those who have trouble hearing are understanding of that. But Dad, you know, you're a legend. And now I'm showing the picture of Jesse Jackson. So before you rest, to say the march, because this is a corporate audience talking about you were fighting for inclusion before anybody really knew what that was. So I.
Well, this is true. Yeah. We actually, that picture with Jesse Jackson, we had been arrested picketing A&P supermarkets because at that time they were a bit discriminatory in employment practices. So we were arrested and we were coming out of court. I just think this is a turning point time in terms of racial reckoning. And I guess I want people to feel that they've got a dog in the fight, that in a sense, we're not talking about race, but we're talking about the incompleteness of our awareness of American history. Mm-hmm. And a group like this, how are we going to revisit the history that has been left out to help us understand? And to help us understand that despite the magnificent messages of the founders, et cetera, they, of course, like all of us, were compromised. But in fact, for a nation to begin with the displacement of the native and indigenous property, and then of course to have slaves, and then to segregate those slaves. And I guess I want to think the Dales that in a sense, the chickens have come home to roost to touch not all, some people, but all of us. And that in a sense, I'd say, we talk about that the United States is in need of a reconstruction. We know what happened in the reconstruction, but in a sense, as great as we are, we're seeing that there are compromises that people are making beyond race, and they are showing up.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm going to leave you on to listen in and comment. And again, I apologize if it's not loud. I mean, my dad is partially blind, so he couldn't really dial in. But he's, we don't practice this, but the segue is perfect because, Dad, my next slide is talking about the importance of halls of fame, of knowing the history. And so I'm putting up a picture, of some folks that, I don't know if anybody, Mary Ellen Pleasant is the first person on the left. Mary Ellen Pleasant was actually the first Black millionaire. She was in San Francisco, made her money with precious metals and real estate. And so we, founded the Black Entrepreneurship Hall of Fame because there's so many outstanding folks who are Black who've been overlooked in the history books. The gentleman in the middle, Onesimus, was the creator of the process that led to the eradication of smallpox. So as we're talking about COVID-19, a Black slave actually helped to get rid of smallpox, which was the virus of the day. And then I have Ora Mae Washington, who was probably the best Black woman tennis player of all time. She was not only the best tennis player, but she was actually the best basketball player in the country. And so these halls of fame are so important. So as we talk about this history, Dad, and building on what you've done, we talk so much about the oppression, which is critically important, but there are also people who've been able to be superstars even with that oppression. And so that's part of that's part of it. And so as we move there, so the civil rights movement, and my dad's influence, and my mom, who was a school teacher for 50 years, really inspired me to say this history is important to teach young people. So we come to the Black Lives Matters protests because, and this is what I've said, is that as horrible as it is now, it's gotten better. A lot of people think it's gotten worse, but the only difference is if you're Black, you understand all these things that are going on, but now they're on video, they're in digital form, so that the rest of the world is starting to see things that folks in the Black community have seen for years. And that's, and wonderfully, Dad, as you said, that's fueling a discussion, an awareness, an interest. That's fueling conversations like these that we hope will continue going forward. Then now the discussions on race and racism. So there are more and more, and I love that the corporate America is now really open to these kinds of discussions, but there's a lot of confusion as to what to do next. Where do we go? How do we make the most of these discussions? And so what we really want to do is kind of bridge the civil rights movement and the issues around race to kind of connect it to the past, the past to the present. And so as my dad knows, in my dissertation at Seton Hall, I used some indices, some measures to really find out if there's a correlation between that and standardized test scores. And I actually did it in Massachusetts. So I coined something called the reading level index, which is the percentage of fourth graders that read at grade level. And tragically, most Americans don't understand. And this is an outgrowth because most of these communities are communities of color. But look at these numbers. So if you go to Baltimore, in purple are the percentage of young people that actually are reading at grade level. This is done by the National Assessment of Educational Progress Test Scores 2017. So 14% in Baltimore. That means 86% of the students don't read at grade level in 4th grade. And most educators say that it's very hard to catch up if you're not reading at grade level. Look at those numbers. Chicago, 79%. Detroit, 92%. Dallas, 84%. Even New York City, 72%. So this is some of the reality that as we're talking about, moving forward and growing, that it's important to invest in these communities so that the quality of the workforce grows. The quality of the workforce is enhanced for all people. So then the next thing I did, and is this thing called the Living Wage Index, which is the percentage of households that can pay their bills. And what I did in my dissertation is to see if there was a statistical correlation between the Living Wage Index and standardized test scores. And we found a 71% correlation between how much people made and their standardized test scores. Nothing to do with teachers or the curriculum. It really was about income. And then you look at these numbers. And in places like Baltimore, almost 42% of the people can't pay their bills. In Detroit, 55% of the people can't pay their bills. And this is based on the MIT Living Wage Calculator, which says what a household needs to make to survive. So as we're talking about some of the issues, and with Black Lives Matters, we talk about the police issues, but poverty undergirds so much of what we do. And so why is it that we can't find as many senior executives to hire and others? But you have to look at the marching helped to increase opportunities for people of color, but you start to look at the education and the living environment. And so the Living Wage Index is really the reason why there's so much interaction with police, because people need to steal or do something wrong to pay their bills and survive. And so I say that those of us who are in corporate America really need to understand that investing in these communities is critically important. So, one of the things that I like to talk about is why do we have racism and why do we have sexism and why do we have war and why do we have conflict and all that stuff? And the late Carl Sagan and some other scientists put together they wanted people to understand the history of the universe and put together a kind of a 1-year history of the universe. And if there was such a thing as the Big Bang, it would have been January 1st, obviously the first second. Earth would come around about September 25th. But the interesting thing is that human beings would be here about December 31st around 10 p.m. So we're relatively new in our ability to interact with other people. As much as we can fly around the world and our technology is amazing, we don't know each other. And so the framework that I developed is really all about influence and to understand that we're a product of our influence. And so, I was writing a book on leadership and I looked up Webster's definitions of leadership, command, and authority and was amazed to find the word influence in each one of those definitions. And so that set me on a path to really study this word called influence, and found that it's hidden in plain sight, that this word is used all the time, that he's an influencer, she's an influencer. Does that mean they have more social media followers? Are they richer? Are they more attractive? Are they more powerful? But you start to realize that we do what we do, think the way we think, and accomplish what we accomplish because of influence. So as you look at what's going on within an organization, and this applies to the organization as well as the individual, influences determine organizations as much as that determines people. So when you begin to think about that, you start to say, and those people who say, okay, well, give me an example. The example I use are English accents. That no child is born with an accent. They could be born in Brooklyn or Johannesburg or Birmingham, Alabama, or London or Sydney, Australia, and develop a very different English accent that often stays with them for the rest of their life. So think about your favorite sports team, your culture, your religion. All those things are influences. When you're born in an empty cup, and so the influences dictate what you do and how you think. And so one of the things that doing the research, I like to say I know what the best music in the world, and the best music in the world, according to the research, is the music you heard between ages 14 and 25. And it doesn't mean you don't like other stuff, but your brain is developing. And so I use music as an analogy for our view of leadership, our view of diversity, our view of inclusion, our view of equity. And so my question is, what is your music and what is the music of your team? And the reason I use that is that it becomes an easy conversation. Because if you ask somebody, are you an inclusive person, you can take that very personally. But your music, your influences you may have never interacted with people who are very different than you. That's okay. That's not your fault necessarily, but it's important for us to have this conversation going forward to really understand the roots of what we're doing. And so I created this diagram of circles of influence, that all of us are represented by, we represent these circles of influences, our inner circle, our closest friends, our social circle, the people we may work with or spend a lot of time with, our community circle, where we live, and our global circle, what's going on around us. All of these impact ourselves and how we view ourselves. One of the biggest mistakes that society makes is this idea of the self-made person, that I did it myself. I worked hard, nobody helped me, and no one's ever done that. The reality is that people have breaks. Some people have breaks at birth. Some people have breaks because of a professor or a teacher or a parent or a boss. And so it's important for us to own up to that, because then it helps us understand people that may not have had good influences, people that may not have been afforded the opportunities that we had. And just quickly, many of you may have heard of Malcolm Gladwell, a New York Times bestselling author, and 3 of his books, or the one was A Tipping Point, which talks about the influences that create a trend, that there's a pattern of influences that create a trend, and he used the 70s Hush Puppies as one of the examples. The next is Blink, and that we all have these instantaneous judgments that come from our prior influences. So we'll see somebody and subconsciously we'll have a perspective on them without really knowing where it comes from. But the book that I liked the most was Outliers. And Outliers starts with the Canadian hockey, and then what they found is that hockey players, hold on a sec, the best hockey players in Canada were born January, February, March, or April. And why is that? Well, it's because they used a calendar year. So the earlier in the year you were born, the bigger you were, the more attention you got, and that carried you all the way through the NHL. So those influences, and the other example I use is that they talk about the icons of Silicon Valley. You know, you look at Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison of Oracle, and as he looked into their background, he found that they had access to the internet long before anybody knew what it was. And they came around at the right time to start companies that have been extraordinarily successful. There are people born before and after who are just as smart and just as hardworking, but didn't have that opportunity. So I say all that to say that the influences determine so much of what we do and how we think and what we accomplish inside and outside of work. And so one of the things that I really discovered is there are 2 basic types of influence. One is social influence, which we're talking about how we're influenced by other people. The other is neuro-influence. And having been the head of an urban school in Trenton, New Jersey, I found that many of the students had what seemed like post-traumatic stress disorder, and I coined a term called urban traumatic stress disorder because it wasn't post. And so they would deal with chaos and challenges and sometimes abuse that would adjust their amygdala, and their ability to control nothing to do with how smart they were, but their ability to control emotions was impacted. And so that neuro influences really causes some of the things we saw with the reading level index and the living wage index. You know, I'm focusing more on social influence, but as we talk about this and we look at the trends in society, so often we think that corporate problems are isolated, that they're on their own, that we should only focus on the corporation. But we are in it together, that society is impacted, whether it's the sales of your product or the people you hire. So why is this more important now than ever? Well, what happened is when the business world was very monolithic, where people had pretty similar backgrounds, same gender, leadership control was dominant. And so a CEO would say jump and people would say how high, because I want to be that CEO because they looked and acted and came from similar places. Well, now that was when diversity was the exception, not the rule. But now diversity is the rule, not the exception. And so you can't have leadership control because now CEOs will say jump and people will say, I'm busy, why don't you jump? I don't want your job. And so leadership influence is really the way to go. And so this whole framework on understanding how do you influence people in this new environment of business. And so created this framework, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this framework. And so internal influence is how you've been influenced. External influence is how you influence other people. Influence understanding is one, understanding how you've been influenced and how you influence other people. And influence actions are what do you do about it. So let's kind of explore the 4 steps. And the beauty of this is this applies to executive coaching, it applies to strategy consulting, applies to board development, team building, leadership training, sales maximization, social impact programs, diversity, inclusion, and equity. So this whole process of influence, because it starts with people and it starts with you. And one of the challenges is most programs out there start with, okay, let's start today and we're going to make you better. Most companies, they hire you and say, okay, well, you're an ex-company, a woman now, forget your past, you're now part of our culture. Well, their past comes with them. And so we need to understand as we deal with people to understand people's influences so that we can help them be all that they can be. And so I wrote this book that talks about the steps of successful leaders and organizations. And so this is the same intelligent influence pyramid with the influence awareness, step 1, impact 2, management 3, and maximization 4. So let me give an example, a live example of kind of the corporate, what often happens in a lot of corporations. So influence awareness is one, understanding how you've been influenced. So a lot of corporations are influenced to be colorblind, where people are treated equally. And, most people, especially most people of color, say, well, what does colorblind mean? One, if you don't see people being different, then you don't understand the unfairness that has happened in why a civil rights movement was needed. Don't understand that certain people have been left behind. So colorblind is not necessarily a good thing, but a lot of companies say that we're going to just hire the best people. Well, what happens is they don't have diversity, equity, and inclusion because of that. So what's the impact of that? Well, the companies are lacking this diversity, inclusion, and equity because they're colorblind, that they're not actively seeking out people and working harder to get a diverse group. Well, why do you want a diverse group? Well, all the research shows that diverse teams perform significantly better than monolithic teams, especially in a diverse world like we have now. So you're leaving money on the table by not pursuing diversity, inclusion, and equity. So the next step is influence management. So the company develops specific measurable plans to achieve diversity, inclusion, and equity goals. And this is good. And a lot of companies are starting to do that. And the key is the goals have to be measurable. And typically, income has to be tied to achieving those goals to really make sure that they happen. And influence maximization is a company implements training and processes that involve enhancing employees' understanding of true diversity. What does diversity mean? Does it mean just hiring a lot of people and having a percentage without looking at inclusion and equity? They need to understand what I call their inclusion music, and we'll spend some time on this to understand what am I doing with inclusion? And then the bottom line benefits of equity, that by bringing people who are different into the mix at senior levels, your company can strategically be better in a time like this, as we're dealing with COVID, as we hopefully will eventually get out of COVID next year and move to a brand new world of business. So one of the things, let me go through the process with what I call racial inclusion music. So I always start this, and if I'm doing a workshop, we have people go through this and start out with everybody understanding, and I encourage each of you to do this on your own, is to think about who's influenced me in the past, who's been a big influence, oftentimes parents or a teacher or someone, and it gets a little more difficult as we go down. How have they influenced me? Have they influenced me to do good things or bad things or both? What impact has their influence had on me? And so we go through that and your performance on the job, your performance in the community, your performance as a family person. Are my perspectives reinforced because I spend time with people who think the way I do? One of the challenges we have now in the United States is, you have liberals telling each other they're brilliant and conservatives telling each other they're brilliant, and people aren't talking. We now have two presidential tickets that are probably as diverse and in opinion and view as they can possibly be. And yesterday, history with Kamala Harris being named as the first person of color as a VP and a major ticket. that's major progress and that's major news. And it's important to understand that we're making that progress, and every one of those influences changes and increases the importance of influence in the minds of people. But we've got to be very sensitive to the fact, are we hanging around people who are just like us? Are we going to get out of our comfort zone and really spend time with people that we may not know or maybe even don't like? And so that's kind of the assignment that I give everyone, is I'd like you to find somebody that, or several people that you don't know or don't like, and ask them who their influences are. And I guarantee that you will find that the reason they do things that you don't like is based on their past influences. And so as we try to understand inclusion and diversity, we need to understand and empathize with other people's perspectives. What I do is really teach this process of empathy, because it's the #1 skill in the business world in today's world. If you're going to sell to a group, you have to empathize with their buying habits, their perspectives. You can't look at just numbers and say, oh, well, this group does this. Well, they don't. And the companies that are able to take the time and understand and empathize with a diverse group of people are the ones that are going to be more successful. And it's easier to empathize with diverse groups of people if you have a diverse leadership team. And there is the crux of the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So now, one of the things that I'm asking folks to do is to think about, how have you been influenced to view or notice racial inclusion? One of the things that has frankly frustrated me is that there's some very, very good people who understand diversity and they're open to diversity, but they sit in a room with people who look just like them and don't say anything. They just accept the fact that, well, we have no black people, we have no women, we have no people of color, we have no different people. They just kind of accept that. And so one of the things I'm challenging folks is to ask the question, to really ask the question, to really understand, what are you doing? What is your racial inclusion music? And so I use that music analogy as as we talk about that. Is your racial inclusion music to be quiet? Is it silence? Or is your racial inclusion music to in a very nice way, to kind of reach out and say, Joe, we're in a time of diversity and there's a lot of discussion of this. What do we need to do to get more senior managers of color? And if you ask it that way, people will be very open. You can't be confrontational and say, well, this company is racist, they're not hiring people of color. But is your racial inclusion music silence? Or is your racial inclusion music really trying to create a symphony of people who have different musical styles so that the company is that much more successful? What is the impact on your life of your racial inclusion music? If your racial inclusion music is silence, you're probably hanging around with people who are just like you. You're going out to eat with people like you. You're working on projects with people like you. And now in this time, it doesn't serve a company to have groups like the lunchroom in high school or the lunchroom in college, where you had a black table and a Latino table and a white table and a women table and so on. That doesn't work anymore. And so one of the reasons I suspect that many of you are on the call is that we need to begin to really be open and honest, but not accusatory. And so the thing about influence is that if someone is insensitive to that, they weren't born that way. And you have to be sensitive to say, well, they've never really talked to someone. I often say that knowing this framework, I could sit with someone who's in the Klan and sit and ask them, well, how many people who are black and Jewish have you met? And why are they all bad if you haven't met them? And so you begin to really break things down and understand that we're all people who are a product of our influence. The next is, what is your strategy to expand your racial inclusion music? It's okay if your music is silenced now, but it's not okay if you don't develop a strategy to try to create that symphony, to go out of your way to talk to people who are different. It's not easy. It's very hard, especially as you talk politics in this country now. It's very hard for people to go across the aisle and talk to people who are different. I understand that. But we've got to do that now, because we have to come together, or especially in a time of crisis like this, it's critically important. And then what will you do to make an effort to expand your racial inclusion music and advocate for inclusion in both your company and every aspect of your life? Are you ready to do this not only and your company, to do this with your family, friends, to do this in your religious institution. You know, and so as we talk and think about this, so often we look at this as a business objective. So diversity, inclusion, equity, we've got to do this. Let's do this top down. But really, the only way it'll work is what I call people up, where we are actually working from the ground up, working with people to help them understand who they are and realize, we understand you may not have been influenced to understand why this is important, but now we have to all change. And so with that, and so one of the tools that I use in the framework is this idea of every successful human interaction has 3 elements. I don't care if you're trying to sell something, you're trying to convince your boss something, or the people who work for you, or your spouse. You've got to have credibility, or nobody's going to listen to you. But the problem is people often rely on credibility. Well, I've been a bank president for 30 years, and so listen to what I say because I have all the knowledge. Now that doesn't work anymore. Once you're credible, they'll listen to you, but then you've got to be creative. You've got to come up with some innovative, you have to get in their mind's eye. You have to get them to say, oh, well, that's interesting. But so often people think that's enough, being credible and creative. The third piece is connection. And what you have to do in order to maximize your influence is you have to connect with their influences. And one of the things I've learned is that if you aren't connected with your own influences, if you don't know the influences that help to make you who you are, good and bad influences, it's going to be very hard for you to connect with influences of other people, especially those who are very different. So whenever you have trouble convincing somebody of something, I want you to remember this Venn diagram of credibility, creativity, and connection. I will guarantee one or more of those things is missing if you have trouble with that influence. So I promised to end about 2:15 to take some questions. And so I wanted to leave. We're not going to do this now, and I think TLD is going to send this out to the attendees, is this inclusion sensitivity exercise that I often use. And so there's as you can see, there's a center circle and some other circles attached to it. So what we often have people do, and this is something you can do in your office, and certainly you should do it yourself, is just place your name in the center, in the center circle, and write important aspects of your identity in each of the attached circles. An identifier that's important to you. It can be Asian American, African American, Methodist, female, mother, athlete, whatever. But really put the things that are kind of most important to you at the moment that you're doing that. And that in of itself is an exercise. But then what we'd like you to do is just share a story with yourself or with coworkers, if you can do it with a group, about a time you were especially proud to identify with one of the descriptors. And so, I was X, Y, and Z, and this happened, and I was just proud to be part of this group. Then share a story about a time when it was especially painful to be identified with one of the identifiers or descriptors. That the group that you associated with did something very horrible, and you felt and found it very, very painful. And then third, name a stereotype associated with one of the groups with which you identify that is not consistent with whom you are. That so often, there's a stereotype associated with some of those groups, and the stereotypes are usually far off. But this is a very useful exercise because it forces people to begin to really understand their influences, understand that we are all diverse, and understand why diversity, if managed properly, really is the key to maximizing organizational success. And so with that, I want to open it up for questions. That's a picture of my mom and dad. As I said, my dad was, on his back in the hospital and wanted to say a few words. I think he was taken away for some examination, so he's not on the phone anymore. And my mom, they're married 62 years. She's was a school teacher for 50 years. And so that's my picture. And so now I guess we'll open it up for questions.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Dale. Please continue to chat in questions as we go here. I do have one to kick us off. It says, Dr. Caldwell and Reverend Caldwell, thank you so much for your inspirational presentation and leadership. What advice do you have for a national group of Black corporate board directors and hospital trustees organizing to drive diversity, inclusion, and equity within healthcare? I'm sure you know the numbers and outcomes.
Well, that is a fantastic question. Well, first of all, it's amazing that we have that national group. I mean, I'm just so pleased to have that, because corporate boards have been among the last places where diversity, equity, and inclusion has seen its face. And so one of the things that I think it's important, and this is why this idea of intelligent influence is so critical, is to begin to understand the influences of the people that you are trying to convince. That so often, and this applies to people of all backgrounds and races, is that so often we think that, you know, our perspective is the right perspective, and it may very well be, but other people will share it. If I just kind of explain my music, then other people will share the same music. You know, one of the examples that I use is, my roommate in college was a big Bruce Springsteen fan. And so I like Bruce Springsteen. My parents have a condo in Asbury Park and so on, but I'm more of a Kool and the Gang guy. And so I was never going to convince him that Kool and the Gang is better than Bruce, and he was never going to convince me that Bruce was better than Kool and the Gang, two New Jersey groups. But we were able to work together. We're best friends still, because we were able to appreciate other. I like Bruce so much better now than I did before. He likes the Kool and the Gang. And so part of what it is really understanding from whence people come. And I'll tell a little secret. So when I came up with this idea of intelligent influence, before I wrote a book or did anything, I was talking to someone in a wealthy suburb of Newark, and they were saying, you know, I can see giving tax dollars to Newark to subsidize their day education, but not a dime should go to after school programs, because my parents made sure that I studied hard and worked hard, and these parents really need to kind of make sure these students do that. And at one time in my life, I would have said, are you crazy? You know, living in this wealthy community is different than living in a poor community. But instead I said, you know, Joe, you're a really successful person. Who are the influences in your life? And they talked about their CEO dad and their nanny and their tennis pro and their priest. And I said, well, who are the influences in the lives of these kids? And they're silent, because they've never thought about that. So one of the things that we have to do when we're trying to convince others is really understand their music and appreciate where it comes from, even if it's very different than ours. And what I've learned is that at the highest levels of business, that is necessary. And so that wonderful group that you're talking about is really understanding the group that you're trying to convince, and help them see your perspective, and complimenting them, I find, is a trick that works really well. And you will find there's more common ground. I've never not seen that work if done correctly. And also remember this whole idea of credibility, creativity, and connection. And so you want to connect with their influences in a way that's meaningful. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you, Dale. We had a few more questions come in. The next question I have for you is, my company just announced that they are looking for a diversity and inclusion officer. Does it matter if this person is Black?
Well, it matters. What matters are their influences. You know, I think sometimes we look at color of skin, you know, and assume that, you know, that people have, or we look at gender and we assume certain things. But what I will say is that I think sometimes a lot of companies haven't done enough vetting of the people, that they basically say, you're a minority, you know the problem, you can do that. So my sense is, whether the person's Black, white, a man or a woman, you know, Latino, Asian, gay, straight, understand where they come from. What's their vision for diversity? What do they believe in? Do they believe in understanding the influence model? And so I don't think the person has to be Black, but there's a unique experience, you know, being Black. But you know, part of this, and I'll say, you know, I'm you know, the amazing, you know, with Barack Obama in the White House and Kamala Harris being, you know, a nominee for vice president, you know, those are amazing accomplishments. But one of the things that's important to look at is that many of the people who are Black, who are successful, come from families that have confidence, that come from the islands or come from Jamaica, where you believe you can be anything. If you're in Jamaica, you've seen a black everything, a black bank president. I've never met a black bank president of a white bank. So I don't know if I could do that. So when you start to look at people's backgrounds, I would really delve into their backgrounds in a way you can legally without, but ask, what's your view and what experiences have you had working with people who are very different? And how do you think we can grow this company to utilize diversity, inclusion, and equity in a way that's effective for our people, but also profitable for the company? And I think those questions aren't asked enough. And I think one of the other mistakes that we make is that we look at people's past history, and it's not always prologue. And just because somebody's worked in that role in a big company doesn't mean they're more successful. And I've seen so many people who failed from one company to another. Sometimes in a new environment, you want to take chances on people. You want to say, if you really have empathy and understand that they're coming from a good place, they can work within the corporate environment, they can be very, very successful. And the other thing I will say, as someone over 50, that we shouldn't overlook older employees, and that many older folks have a sensitivity and understanding for these chief diversity roles that others don't have. And you say, well, we're looking for somebody for the long term, but the reality is young people don't stay that long. You probably will get more years out of an old person over 50 than you will get someone under 25. So again, we have to kind of challenge. This is all about diversity of thinking, that so often we do the easy thing. Let's look at the resumes where people did exactly the same thing. Well, there's a reason why they're leaving, is they probably weren't very good. So I'm saying you kind of throw out, all old thinking and really look and examine who the person is.
Great. So we've had a number of questions come in. I'm not sure that we're going to have time for all of them. But I'll get back to you with the next one. Let's see. Says, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate your comment with respect to the importance of defining the terms diversity and inclusion prior to arguing the case for the same. Please expand your comment about how the promotion of halls of fame fits into the analysis.
Well, so part of that is, and it's important, especially for young people, to really understand confidence. And I think a lot of people a lot of people who don't share the Black experience don't understand. You said, Dale, you went to Princeton and Wharton. You should think you could be anything. I don't think I can be anything. I think I can work hard. I think I can be successful. But there's something about understanding the importance of. So one of the things in the whole influence model is that if Morgan Freeman and Dennis Haysbert hadn't played strong Black presidents, I'm not sure we would have had a President Barack Obama. I think that the influence of society is much more significant than people think. And so when you look at movies and you see that a certain look is always the hero and a certain person is always the funny one and a certain person is, those stereotypes impact people much more than they think, because we are an entertainment society. So if we can begin to really show that, you don't know how many people don't know Mary Ellen Pleasant or Onesimus, so that Black people have actually done some extraordinary things even when they were slaves, that helps the narrative of helping people have confidence. And having worked a lot in school systems, I realized that there's not a lot of confidence of young people in the system that they can be, at a level that they could participate in this call. Everyone on this call is successful in their own right. There are a lot of people who don't think they deserve this. And I see that in schools, and they don't work hard in school. Some of the smartest kids don't work hard in school. Some of the best mathematicians are drug dealers, and they can count the money in their, in their head and in ways. And so there's a part of society. That's why I like to talk to the corporate world, but also remind that there's this part of society that until we really pick that up, we're not going to be able to be as successful a country as we can be. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about entrepreneurship as the answer to so much of the problems. And so investing in entrepreneurship in the poorest communities is key. So the halls of fame are critical in really helping the narrative that you can be whatever you want to be.
Great, thank you, Dale. Okay, we have time for one more question. I'll leave you with this one. What are some of the common pitfalls companies face as they develop and implement their D&I strategies for the first time?
Well, a couple things. So one, they put time as a priority. You know, one of the reasons that it doesn't happen is not that people don't want it to happen. It's that I'm busy. I've got so much you know, I've got to make these quarterly numbers. I've got to sell. I've got to develop this report. I've got to do so. So problem number one is that it's not made a time priority. And it's like anything else. If you take the time to do it right, it'll save you a lot of time and increase your success in the long run. So time is number one. Two is thinking short term and not long term. You've got to think long term in doing this. You've got to make that investment. Three is thinking that diversity is it. We've hired, we hired, 50% of our hires have been African American. Well, are they included? Is there equity within their roles? And so they don't really look at fully implementing DIE. And I always joke because the people use the acronym diversity, equity, and inclusion when it really is diversity, inclusion, and equity. But DIE is not a great acronym. So it's and then finally, it's important to understand minority suppliers, diversity spend. And so companies really don't do a good job with diversity spend, and they're not held accountable for doing that. And so diversity spend is, and then finally, and then I'll be quiet. I'm sorry the answers are long, but I want to be thorough, is holding people accountable. That so often people have great general goals, but nobody's paycheck is on the line if they don't meet those goals. So you've got to make sure that this is an imperative. If it's imperative for the company, then people will get a bonus or lose money if they aren't met throughout the organization. And so you've got to put some teeth in it. You've got to make it a time priority. You've got to think about all aspects of diversity, including diversity spend. So again, and send your questions, and we'll try to answer them in the future for those I didn't get to.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dale. Do you mind advancing to the final slide?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so thank you again to Dr. Caldwell and to Reverend Caldwell for being here today. Your willingness to go above and beyond to create a meaningful and impactful experience for our attendees is appreciated by all. We've got some amazing comments and compliments that have been coming through the questions panel that we can share with you after the session. And thank you to all of you on the line for joining us today. A few quick notes before we let you go. At the Leadership Development Group, we understand that 60 minutes on such an important topic is not nearly enough, and we're committed to continuing these important conversations. For those of you who may be looking for an interactive and conversational way to engage with amazing facilitators like Dr. Caldwell on topics and challenges relating to equity, diversity, and inclusion, please be on the lookout for communication from TLD Group regarding upcoming small group diversity dialogue events. We will also be sending out a post-webinar survey immediately after this webinar. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback. Thank you again for being here, and we hope you'll join us again for future TLD Group events.
Just thank everybody for allowing me to speak. So I really appreciate it. I thank TLD and Tracy and Jess. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dale.